The flats should have shimmered. By this hour, the air above the ground was usually alive with movement, heat lifting in visible waves, bending the horizon, blurring distant shapes into liquid outlines. Animals learned to read those distortions. Rising heat meant time was passing as expected. It meant the day was advancing, and relief would come later with shade and evening wind. But the heat did not rise. The hartebeest stood alone on the orange flats, its long face angled slightly downward, ears held wide apart, listening as much as watching. Its body was tall and narrow, built for distance rather than speed, muscles lean and economical beneath short, tawny hair that matched the colour of the soil almost perfectly. The ground beneath it was hard, baked smooth by weeks without rain. Fine dust coated everything: hooves, grasses, insects, tinting the landscape in variations of rust, ochre, and pale red. Sparse tufts of grass clung to shallow depressions, brittle and grey-green, stripped of moisture. Normally, by mid-morning, the flats radiated heat upward. Warm air lifted, cooler air rushed in beneath it, and the cycle repeated. It created wind where none existed. It carried scent. It cleared sound. Today, the air stayed pressed close to the ground. The hartebeest shifted its weight slightly, redistributing pressure through its long legs. The movement raised a small puff of dust that hung in place longer than it should have before drifting away slowly, as if the atmosphere lacked urgency. That was wrong. The animal lifted its head higher, nostrils flaring. Smells arrived dull and flattened. Dry grass, distant animals, nothing sharp enough to give direction. Without rising heat, scent did not layer or stretch. Everything stayed close, muddled. The hartebeest had been born on this land. Its body was tuned to patterns older than memory: heat rising, wind forming, insects moving upward as the day warmed. Those patterns told it when to feed, when to move, when to stop. Now the signals were missing. The sun climbed higher, bright and relentless, but the air did not respond. Instead of lifting, warmth accumulated near the surface, pressing against the animal's lower body. The hartebeest felt it first along its legs and belly, where the air was thickest. Heat without movement was heavier. It lowered its head briefly to graze, tearing at dry stems with measured bites. The grass offered little resistance and less nourishment. Each mouthful required more chewing, more time, for diminishing return. Still, feeding occupied the body and calmed the nerves. Around it, the flats remained unnaturally still. Insects moved sluggishly, staying close to the ground instead of lifting into the air. Birds that usually rode thermal currents remained perched, wings tucked, conserving energy. Even distant shapes, other antelope perhaps, seemed fixed in place, their outlines sharp and unmoving against the horizon. The absence of shimmer made distance deceptive. The hartebeest took a few steps forward, hooves striking hard ground with dull, final sounds. No echo carried. No breeze followed. The dust rose and settled without being pulled upward. The heat was building, but it had nowhere to go. This kind of stillness carried risk. Without air movement, body heat lingered. Cooling depended entirely on evaporation and shade, both limited on the open flats. Normally, rising heat created its own escape route. Today, the heat stayed low, pooling around legs and chests, trapping warmth close to muscle and bone. The hartebeest paused again, scanning. Predators relied on movement and distortion to approach unseen. Still air changed those dynamics. It could make danger easier to spot or harder to sense. Without wind, sound travelled oddly. Without shimmer, the horizon lied. The animal turned slightly, angling its body to present a narrower profile to the sun. This was instinctive, a small adjustment learned over countless days under harsh light. But even this brought little relief. The flats stretched outward in every direction, orange and exposed, offering no shade tall enough to matter. Somewhere beyond sight, weather patterns had shifted. High-pressure air sat heavy and unmoving, suppressing convection. The mechanisms that lifted heat away from the ground were stalled. The Hartebeest did not know this. It knew only that the day was behaving incorrectly. As minutes passed, sweat darkened patches of its coat. Breathing deepened slightly. Not panic, just adjustment. The body compensating for an environment that refused to assist. The animal remained standing. Lying down would bring its body closer to the trapped heat near the ground. Moving too far would waste energy with little cooling benefit. Waiting, for now, was the least costly option. The sun continued its climb. The flats remained sharp and unmoving, and the Hartebeest stood in a heat that should have risen, but did not, sensing, without understanding, that the land was holding on to warmth in a way that made even endurance feel uncertain. The day advanced, but it did not progress. Time usually announced itself on the flats through motion, the slow building of wind, the shimmer of heat, the way distant shapes softened and dissolved as the sun climbed. Those changes gave structure to endurance. They told the body when to expect relief, when to spend energy, when to conserve it. Now, the air stayed fixed. The Hartebeest remained standing, legs spread slightly, joints locked in a posture designed to minimize muscular effort. Standing required less energy than walking and far less than running. In normal heat, standing also allowed air to pass along the body, carrying warmth away. Today, there was nothing to carry it. Warmth clung to the animal's lower half, pressing upward like a physical mass. The air felt thicker near the ground, resisting movement. The Hartebeest felt it along its chest and belly, where the fur was shortest and heat exchange usually most efficient. Breathing changed. Each inhale drew in air that was already warm. Each exhale added moisture without dispersal. The animal's nostrils flared wider, not in distress, but in compensation. Evaporation still worked. Sweat darkened the coat, but without air movement, cooling was slow. The Hartebeest flicked an ear. Flies hovered close to the ground, persistent but lethargic. Normally, thermals lifted them higher as the day warmed, spreading them out. Now they clustered low, irritating sensitive skin around the eyes and muzzle. The animal shook its head once, sharply, then stilled again to avoid unnecessary exertion. Across the flats, other animals adjusted similarly. A small group of antelope stood spaced farther apart than usual, minimizing shared body heat. None lay down. None moved far. The land had become a place for waiting, not travelling. The sun reached a height that should have forced change. It did not. Without rising heat, no breeze formed. Without breeze, scent remained pooled and directionless. The Hartebeest tested the air repeatedly, lifting its head and turning it slowly from side to side. Smells arrived dull and short-lived, refusing to stretch into usable trails. This increased risk. Predators often approached against the wind, using thermals to mask sound and scent. With no wind at all, approaches could come from any direction, silent and unannounced. The Hartebeest's ears remained active, rotating constantly, but sound travelled strangely in the dense air, too far in some moments, not far enough in others. The ground itself radiated heat upward, but unevenly. Darker patches of soil grew hotter than lighter ones, creating small pockets of intense warmth near the hooves. The Hartebeest shifted again, stepping onto slightly lighter ground by instinct, seeking minimal relief. The movement raised dust that again refused to lift. It hovered briefly, then settled back where it had been. This was exhausting in a way that running was not. There was no release, no moment where effort ended and assistance began. Every adaptation required constant input. The body could not hand responsibility over to the environment. As the afternoon approached, the Hartebeest's breathing deepened further. The rhythm remained steady, but each breath moved more air. Heat regulation demanded more work now. The animal lowered its head to graze again, not from hunger, but because feeding forced slow, regular jaw movement, a behavior that calmed the nervous system. The grass tasted dry and mineral-heavy. Nutrients were sparse, but chewing anchored the animal to something familiar. Nearby, a bird attempted to take flight. It flapped hard, rising only a short distance before dropping back down, unable to catch the thermal lift that usually carried it upward effortlessly. The sound of its wings lingered longer than expected in the still air. The Hartebeest watched briefly, then returned its attention to the horizon. The flats were not dangerous yet, but they were becoming demanding. The heat continued to build near the surface, thickening the air around every living body. Without upward movement, the day compressed itself downward, pressing endurance into smaller margins. The Hartebeest remained standing, conserving energy, waiting for a change that should have come naturally. The heat still would not rise, and the longer it stayed trapped near the ground, the more the stillness itself became something the animal had to survive. By mid-afternoon, the flats began to feel smaller, not in distance, but in options. Shade did not appear where it should have, and movement offered no advantage. The sun stood high, sharp and unwavering, yet the air below it remained compressed and heavy, refusing to lift and circulate. The Hartebeest had been standing for hours. Muscles designed for long-distance travel now worked in a different way, holding posture, resisting collapse, distributing weight evenly through long limbs that could not fully relax. Standing was still less costly than walking, but the margin had narrowed. Heat accumulation became internal. The animal's coat, short and efficient under normal conditions, trapped warmth when evaporation slowed. Sweat darkened the fur along the neck and shoulders, then spread down the flanks. Without air movement, moisture lingered, reducing its cooling effect. Breathing deepened again. The Hartebeest began to open its mouth slightly between breaths, not panting fully, but increasing airflow. This was a sign of adjustment, not distress, yet. Still, it marked a threshold. Internal temperature management was becoming active rather than passive. The animal shifted position, turning its body more directly away from the sun. The adjustment helped briefly, reducing direct exposure along the chest and face, but reflected heat from the ground replaced what was lost. The flats radiated upward without releasing. In the distance, a faint line of dust marked a group of animals moving slowly. They were not running, just repositioning, searching for marginally better conditions. The dust plume hung low, spreading sideways instead of rising, evidence of the same stalled air. The Hartebeest considered movement. Instinct urged caution. Running would generate heat rapidly, pushing the body toward dangerous thresholds without guarantee of relief. Yet standing too long carried its own cost. Muscles stiffened, circulation pooled in lower limbs. Heat continued to accumulate. Waiting was no longer neutral. The animal took several measured steps forward, hooves striking hard ground with heavy finality. Each step sent a small shock up through the legs. The movement produced no breeze, no cooling. Dust again lifted briefly and settled back down. After only a short distance, the Hartebeest stopped. The effort had cost more than expected. Its breathing deepened noticeably now, chest expanding farther with each inhale. The rhythm remained controlled, but the volume increased. Sweat beaded along the muzzle and dripped onto the ground, darkening dust where it landed. This was the cost point. Beyond it, choices narrowed quickly. Predators remained absent for now. Many avoided moving in this kind of heat. But absence was not safety. If a threat appeared suddenly, the Hartebeest's ability to respond would depend on reserves it was now slowly spending just to remain upright. The animal lowered its head and held it there, reducing sun exposure to the eyes and brain. This posture also slowed movement and encouraged stillness, a last attempt to minimize heat production. The air remained unmoving. Somewhere far above, atmospheric conditions held heat trapped near the surface, preventing convection. The mechanism that normally lifted warmth away from the ground had stalled, flattening temperature gradients and suppressing wind formation. On the flats, the result was compression, of heat, of effort, of time. The Hartebeest flicked its tail weakly, dislodging a few flies. Even the insects seemed reluctant to rise into the air, clinging low where warmth pooled. The animal stood at the edge of its comfort zone, not in crisis, but beyond ease. Endurance now required conscious adjustment rather than instinctive flow. If the air remained still much longer, the balance would tip. Waiting, once the safest option, was becoming expensive, and the heat still would not rise. Late afternoon arrived without transition. The sun's angle shifted, but the flats did not respond. Shadows shortened only slightly, then seemed to stall, as if time itself had slowed. Normally, this was the hour when the land began to loosen its grip, when rising heat weakened and air finally started to move, hinting at evening relief. Nothing changed. The hartebeest felt the strain now not just in its muscles, but in its attention. The constant need to regulate posture, breathing, and exposure dulled the sharpness that usually came easily. Vigilance required effort. The ears still rotated, the eyes still scanned, but the intervals between checks grew longer. This was dangerous. Predators exploited moments like these, not when prey was panicked, but when it was tired of waiting. The hartebeest shifted again, forcing movement through stiffening joints, reminding its body that it might still need to run. The effort spiked heat briefly, pushing sweat production higher. Moisture spread across the shoulders and down the neck, then lingered. Cooling remained inefficient. The animal stopped almost immediately. The flats offered no assistance. Around it, the world seemed suspended. Distant animals remained visible in sharp detail, as if cut out against the horizon. Normally, by this time, heat distortion would blur edges, offering concealment and confusion. Now, everything was exposed. That exposure cut both ways. Predators could be seen sooner, but they could also see better. The hartebeest raised its head higher, extending its neck to maximize view while minimizing body movement. This posture increased airflow around the throat and chest slightly, a marginal gain in cooling. The air remained heavy. Then, without warning, something changed, not in temperature, but in pressure. The animal felt it as a faint easing along its flank, a subtle shift against the skin. The change was so small it might have gone unnoticed if the hartebeest had not been tuned so closely to the environment all day. A breath of air moved. It was not a breeze, not yet, but it was direction. Dust lifted this time and drifted sideways instead of falling straight down. A few insects rose slightly higher than before, testing the movement. The hartebeest froze, every sense focused. The air moved again, barely perceptible, but real. A thin layer of warm air began to slide upward, displaced by slightly cooler air beneath. Convection, long suppressed, was restarting. Relief did not arrive immediately, but possibility did. The animal's breathing slowed a fraction. Sweat began to evaporate more effectively, carrying heat away at last. The weight pressing against its lower body eased slightly. The change was fragile. The pressure system could still reassert itself. The air could still stall again. But for the first time all day, the environment responded. The hartebeest took a few slow steps, not fleeing, not grazing, simply repositioning to face into the faint movement. This aligned its body with the emerging flow, maximizing what little cooling existed. The flats, still orange and exposed, began to loosen their hold. Heat did not rise fully yet, but it had begun to move. And as evening approached, the hartebeest stood, tired but intact, having endured a day when the land refused to behave as expected, and learning, once again, that survival was often about waiting for the smallest changes, and recognizing them when they finally arrived.